Hi everyone, welcome back to the New Heritage Wool channel, where I do everything from drafting patterns, long form patterning projects, and tailoring projects, and discussions on textiles. In today's video, I'm going to draft a very basic collar. So if you'd like to follow along, all you really need is either a bodice block or a pattern, whether it is a store-bought pattern or a digital download pattern. Or say you need to replace a collar or you want to redesign a collar for a shirt, grab that shirt and you should be able to follow along in the video with that as well. Without further ado, let's jump into the tutorial and begin drafting a basic collar from scratch. To get started, I'm going to tape together my shoulder seams, and then I'm going to measure from center front all the way to center back minus any seam allowance. To do this, I like to use my clear plastic ruler and pivot along my seam allowance on the neck, going from center front to my shoulder seam. And then I like to make note of my measurement in this way, and then later I also write it on the pattern paper that I work off of. Just sprucing it up a little bit so I know that the camera can see what I'm doing. Now, same thing for the back, going for my shoulder seam all the way to the center back seam, and again, without seam allowances included. Now I'm going to get out a fresh new piece of paper, and I'm going to take note of what it was that I found. So for the front neck, I have 4 inches times 2, which would be 8, and then the back neck is 3 3/8 times 2 is 6 3/4. Now, squaring off a new line, I'm going to mark my center back neck, and then measuring up from my center back neck 3 inches. That's how tall I want my collar to be. And then I'm going to mark where my shoulder notch will be and where my center front of this collar will be. So here I'm labeling my center back, shoulder notch, and center front. Labeling B, D, and C. Now I'm going to square up a line from point C, just extending it past the 3-inch mark that I have on my center back. Then I'm going to measure up a point ½ inch from C and label it E. And then 1/4 inch from point D is then my notch. I'm going to take my French ruler here and blend letter E into D. Squaring off a line from that 3-inch line from B all the way over to C, and then measuring an inch over to the right and connecting this point to my new point E. Here you can see the tip of the collar starting to form. I'm adding a grain line here. And then this is it for a basic collar. This is just the foundation. So I'm going to call this the collar foundation, because I'm going to take this and I'm going to start manipulating it just a little bit to get my final product for a collar. So I'm going to cut this out and then prepare a new piece of paper, squaring off a line here in a minute. Make sure to cut accurately. What I like to do whenever I'm tracing off is only trace off the points and main lines. I never really trace the whole thing. I like to use my straight edge on connecting all of the points, which you'll see here in a minute. This is how I make sure all of my lines are really nice and smooth. As you can just see, I only did the tip and the top and the bottom curved part. And then I am now using my ruler to connect all of these. I extend my lines way past each point, and I do this on purpose, and it helps during the seam allowance process, which you'll see in a little bit. So I've traced this off. Now I'm going to begin. I need to reduce the center back neck 1/8 of an inch, which you see here, and I'm putting hash marks through the line that I don't want to use. And then from here, all right, I'm going to go in and add a grain line and label it under collar. The under collar is the only part that will have the 1/8 inch shorter back. And the reason for this is because it helps the collar at that seam line. The top collar will start to fold under, and it just makes it look very nice and clean. Now what I'm doing here is I'm adding in my seam allowance. I'm removing that one line that I no longer need and putting it back, making it nice and clean, and adding in 1/4 inch all the way around. I now see that, I mean, technically you don't need a center back seam in your collar. So if you are following along, unless there's some reason you would like to, I mean, a design feature would be that if you were using stripes, you could have one side of your collar be one direction, stripes, and the other side another direction. It all just depends on what you're going for. But as I finish up the seam allowance, this is my under collar. And then I'm also putting in center back notches, just in case it is something I want to have a center back seam. So really when you're designing, it's up to you what you want to do. Typically, a traditional collar will have a cut on the fold for the direction of cut. Midway, I decided to scooch my grain line over and relabel it, and it's still getting the same name. It's the under collar. All right, and then I score off another line, and I'm going to make the upper collar. And this is super easy, super quick. It is exactly the same. And then I add seam allowance on, making sure that, again, I'm only transferring the tip and the curve, and then I use my straight edge to make everything nice and clean. And this again is because when I'm cutting out, I may not cut perfectly straight, so I want to use a straight edge to make everything nice and clean. I'm labeling my shoulder placement on my under collar and on my upper collar. This will be indicated with a notch. Finishing this up with some seam allowance, which is of course the same as the other one, 1/4 of an inch. When I do curves on seam allowance, I like to do what I'm doing here and just put a little bitty dot about 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch apart, and then use my French curve to connect all of the dots. And just fine-tuning my seam allowance here. I really like all of my lines to go straight through the seam allowance. This helps line everything up when I'm going to cut out. Transferring my notches, just cleaning up this line again. It was a little messy, so I want to make sure that it's nice and clean. I very much prefer having the cleanest patterns I possibly can. This just leaves less room for error whenever I'm sewing and cutting. All right, making my notch lines, labeling my center back, and creating my grain line, which will receive the upper collar name. Now, a couple of things you can add for your name or what you're doing for your grain line. So sometimes people will put a style number or cut 1, cut 2, and then what fabric they're cutting it out of. So cutting out of self. Is it going to be, you want to be more specific? You can put satin or cotton lawn, whichever. just for more detail. And this, I'm just checking that, yes, my under collar is 1/8 of an inch shorter than my upper collar, which it is. And as you see, it is pretty quick and simple to draft a pattern for your basic collar. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have questions or want to suggest anything you'd like me to pattern out for you to demonstrate on how to do things, leave a comment in the section below and I will be happy to read through those, answer any questions, and consider suggestions on things you'd like to see patterned. But until next time, I hope you have a wonderful and blessed day, and I'll see you in my next video.